The fire that consumed the temple did not stop at its golden walls. It followed the men who had once stood inside that sanctuary, who had worn the breastplate and spoken the sacred name once a year in a room no other human being was permitted to enter. And when the smoke cleared over Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era, one question remained that most tellings of this story conveniently skip past. What happened to the family? Not the nation, not the faith. The actual family. The wives, the sons, the daughters, the bloodline that had guarded the holiest office in the ancient world for over 1,000 years. Their story did not end when the building did. In some ways, it had only just begun, and it is far darker and far more human than anything you were taught in Sunday school. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what the high priesthood actually was before Rome arrived with its siege engines. This was not a religious title in the way we understand clergy today. The high priest of Jerusalem was arguably the single most powerful hereditary office in the ancient Near East. He controlled the temple treasury, which functioned as something close to a national bank. He held judicial authority over religious law. He was the only man alive permitted to walk into the Holy of Holies, and he did so once a year on the Day of Atonement, tied by a rope around his ankle in case he died in the presence of God and had to be dragged out, because no one else could enter to retrieve his body. This was a family business soaked in mortal stakes, passed down through bloodlines that traced themselves, at least in claim, all the way back to Aaron, brother of Moses. By the time Rome's legions surrounded Jerusalem, the priesthood had already been transformed by decades of political corruption. The office was no longer purely hereditary in practice. Roman-appointed governors and Herodian kings had turned the high priesthood into something closer to a political appointment, bought, sold, and rotated among a handful of powerful priestly dynasties. The House of Annas, the House of Boethus, the House of Phoebe. These families circled the position like nobility circling a throne. Annas himself held the office for 9 years and then watched 5 of his sons, and eventually his son-in-law Caiaphas, rotate through it after him. This was not a solitary man in robes. This was a dynasty with property, with slaves, with fortified homes in the upper city of Jerusalem, foundations of which archaeologists have actually uncovered. The so-called burnt house, a residence identified with a priestly family, its floor still scattered with carbonized debris from the very fire that ended everything. By the year 66, when the Jewish revolt against Rome ignited, the high priestly families found themselves caught in an impossible position. Many of the priestly aristocracy had grown wealthy under Roman occupation and had no interest in provoking the empire. But the war party, the group historians often call the Zealots, though the reality was a coalition of several militant factions, saw the priestly elite as collaborators. In a moment of brutal irony, when the revolutionaries seized control of the temple itself in the year 67, they did something almost unthinkable. They discarded the hereditary priestly families entirely and chose a new high priest by lottery from among the ordinary priestly stock, a stonemason named Phinehas, son of Samuel, a man with no political pedigree at all. The ancient dynasties that had run the temple for generations were pushed aside by their own people before Rome ever breached the walls. This detail matters because it means that by the time the temple actually fell, the high priesthood as an institution was already fractured, already humiliated, already stripped of the very families who had once defined it. The war had turned the priestly aristocracy into refugees inside their own city. Then came the siege. Titus, son of the Emperor Vespasian, brought 4 legions against Jerusalem. The city endured a blockade so severe that the historian Josephus, himself a priest, a member of one of these very same aristocratic families, and an eyewitness to the catastrophe, described mothers eating their own children in starvation-induced madness. When the walls finally broke in the late summer of the year 70, Roman soldiers moved through the city with the kind of violence that ancient warfare reserved for cities that had dared to resist an empire for this long. The temple itself burned on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, a date so catastrophic that Jewish tradition still marks it as a day of mourning to this very day, 1955 years later. Josephus tells us that as the sanctuary burned, priests still inside the building threw themselves into the flames rather than be captured. He names specific individuals. He describes the chief priests, men whose families had held the highest religious office in the nation, being dragged before Titus in chains. And here the story stops being about symbols and becomes about people, because Josephus records something almost unbearably specific. Roman soldiers seized the priestly garments themselves, the breastplate, the golden vestments, the sacred vessels, and paraded them through the streets of Rome in a triumph alongside the captured priests, humiliated in public before the entire imperial capital. But what happened to the family Onon, the wives left behind in Jerusalem, the sons and daughters who did not choose to fight, who simply carried a bloodline that had suddenly become both sacred and radioactive? The honest answer, pieced together from Josephus, from later rabbinic sources, and from the archaeological record, is that they scattered into 3 distinct and equally brutal fates. The first fate was slavery. Roman policy following the destruction was ruthless and systematic. Josephus records that 97,000 Jewish captives were taken during the war, and that the strongest were sent to labor in the mines of Egypt, while others were distributed across the provinces to die in gladiatorial games and public spectacles staged in celebration of the Roman victory. Priestly families were not exempt from this fate simply because of their former status. In fact, their prominence sometimes made them targets, valuable trophies to be displayed rather than protected. Young priestly daughters, women who under temple law could never have married outside strict purity codes, were sold into households across the Mediterranean world, their sacred lineage suddenly meaningless currency in a slave market. The second fate was exile by choice rather than by chains. A portion of the priestly aristocracy, sensing the coming catastrophe before the final siege, had already fled Jerusalem in the years leading up to the war, resettling in Galilee, in the coastal cities, or crossing into the Jewish communities of Babylon, which had remained a thriving center of Jewish life since the earlier exile centuries before. These families carried something with them that no Roman soldier could confiscate: memory. They carried genealogical records, oral traditions of exactly which priestly family belonged to which of the 24 priestly divisions, the Mishmarot, that had rotated through temple service on a fixed calendar for centuries. And this brings us to the third fate, the quiet one, the one that almost nobody discusses because it involves not drama but bureaucracy. And yet it may be the most consequential of all. The temple archives, the actual physical genealogical scrolls that verified who was and was not a legitimate descendant of Aaron, burned along with everything else. This was not incidental. Priestly status in Jewish law required documented proof of lineage. Without the scrolls, without the archive, an entire caste of families now had to rely purely on memory and oral testimony to preserve an identity that had once required official documentation. Imagine losing not your home, not your temple, but the literal paperwork proving who you were. And yet, and this is where the story refuses to end in tragedy alone, the priestly families did not disappear. In the decades following the destruction, rabbinic sages in the Galilean town of Usha and later in Tiberias undertook an extraordinary project. They worked to reconstruct from memory, tradition, and testimony the assignments of the 24 priestly courses, recording which family belonged to which division and where each family had resettled after fleeing Jerusalem. Remarkably, fragments of this exact record have survived not in scripture but carved in stone. In the 20th century, archaeologists excavating ancient synagogues at Caesarea and at Ashkelon uncovered inscriptions listing the priestly courses by name and by the towns to which they had relocated. A physical stone confirmation that the priestly families had scattered across the Galilee and rebuilt their communal identity in exile, town by town, generation by generation. This means the descendants of the temple's priestly aristocracy did not vanish into the ash of the year 70. They reorganized, they migrated. Some traveled as far as Babylon and later into Persia, planting the roots of Jewish communities that would flourish for another 1,000 years. Others remained scattered across the land of Israel, their priestly identity preserved purely through inherited memory, passed father to son, a whispered inheritance with no building left to justify it. And extraordinarily, that inheritance did not die with antiquity. The tradition of priestly descent, known in Hebrew as Kohanim, continued through the medieval period and into the modern world, carried in family names, Cohen, Kahane, Katz, and in specific ritual customs still observed in synagogues today, including the priestly blessing performed by men who claim purely through unbroken family memory descent from that same lineage that once served inside the burning temple. In the late 20th century, genetic researchers studying Jewish populations across entirely separate diasporas, men who had never met, whose ancestors had been separated for nearly 2,000 years, some in Yemen, some in Eastern Europe, discovered a shared genetic marker on the Y chromosome among those who identified as Kohanim, a pattern now known as the Cohen modal haplotype. Science, centuries later, quietly confirmed what oral memory alone had preserved through exile, slavery, and dispersion. So when the question is asked, what happened to the high priest's family after the temple fell, the truest answer is not a single fate. Some burned inside the sanctuary rather than surrender. Some were dragged in chains through the streets of Rome as imperial trophies. Some were sold as slaves into households that never knew what bloodline they had purchased. And some simply walked north into Galilee, carrying nothing but a name and a memory, determined that Rome could burn the building, but it could not burn who they were. 2,000 years later, that determination is still being tested in a laboratory, in a strand of DNA and a surname whispered at the front of a synagogue. Proof that even when history tries to erase a people down to their archives, some things refuse to stay buried.